everyone is, hopefully everyone is okay with that. So welcome. I'll just reiterate for the recording that all of these reflections are my own and I don't represent any other body or organization. And that is May 27th, 2024. So welcome everyone. I'm going to start the presentation and talk through with some slides. So can everyone see that? So this is actually a mural on the wall from Kfar Aza. And I thought it was very powerful, these beautiful, hopeful messages. Because to me, in my mind, when I think about Israel and Israeli society and my experiences in the country, they are warm and positive feelings. So this was sort of a description of what that meant to me. Because the trip happened at a time specifically when UNRWA had suspension of its funding from most of the countries in the world. After it was acknowledged, there was evidence that there were a number of UNRWA employees who were associated with the attacks on October 7th. It really changed the frame and colored everything, including my plane ride over. And I wanted to start with a brief story. So part of this trip was a CIJA mission. That's the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, Jewish leadership from across the country, that is from across Canada, joined to do a two-part mission. The first was to go to Geneva, Switzerland, to the United Nations, but actually not to the United Nations. We were at a summit that essentially was organized by UN Watch. So it coincided with the beginning of the Human Rights Commission session, but it was actually specifically a summit about UNRWA and alternatives to UNRWA. So at the time when I was traveling, and I had been asked by politicians or even different organizations about statements on UNRWA or if they should be calling for resumption of funding to UNRWA. And at the time, the investigations were ongoing. And my recommendation to those who called to ask me was simply to wait and to make sure that we were just the results of those investigations were known. I happened to sit down next to someone who I had known earlier in my life, but I didn't recognize. But more importantly, they were friends of an old boyfriend who worked at the UN together. And he was actually one of the people who was out talking to governments, trying to get them to resume funding for UNRWA. We had a very interesting conversation on the plane. And that conversation was around the importance of neutrality. And so before I delve even further into where we are, I want to make sure that you share the experience of knowing what I found out on that plane. Two important parts. The first one is that the UN does not consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. And I was quite surprised to hear this, especially at that time, because all of the EU, all of the Western countries in the world do recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. The UN sees them simply as the government in power in Gaza. And that itself changes the frame for which we can understand what's happening, both on an international scale, but why it's perceived from the Jewish community that there is a bias at the UN against Israel. And we had a really honest and frank conversation on the plane about that. And what he said to me was, he talked about the bias of America, that the US bias towards Israel was so intense that the UN was almost acting as a counterpoint to this American bias. And my question to him at the time, and what I posit to you, is really, what is neutrality? And what is the goal that we're really trying to seek. So for me, if that goal is peace in the Middle East, if that goal is to have a two-state solution, which certainly is what Canada would like to see as a country, and certainly the US and many places in the world, if that's the expectation, two-state solution and ultimately peace in the Middle East, then the goal for a UN body, for an international body, has to be neutrality. That neutrality isn't actually being a counterpoint position to a superpower, but rather a neutral body. And that if there was bias at the UN, that ultimately you take yourself out of the game of peacemaker. You neutralize that position, and really cause a cascade of failure of the peace process itself. And I think in many ways that realization, especially going in and literally flying to Geneva, made me reflect really hard on what it was that the UN is really doing, and what the opportunities could be if we actually did take the role of neutrality seriously and demanded that of the UN. Of course, we know that now most countries, especially, I mean, including Canada, have resumed funding UNRWA. And I think long term, we need to discuss the role of UNRWA. And certainly for right now, they definitely are in a position to help, and help is what's needed. So from my perspective, even an organization that's flawed but able to deliver aid is valuable. The summit itself was really interesting. Here are two of the speakers. One of them is Hillel Neuer, who is the CEO and founder of UN Watch. It's essentially a watchdog organization from the UN, in particular around Israel, but really around human rights in general. And the woman in the picture is Ambassador Merav Elon Shahar. She's been ambassador for a few years, and she told some really interesting stories about the way that these countries work, from a diplomatic effort, and that countries may not have a diplomatic relationship, but they would have a personal relationship. So even though Israel might not have a friendly official reaction to even a caring and compassionate one officially for Iran, for something happening in Iran, an earthquake, a flood, but she would certainly go and give her regards, and there was professional courtesy, and there was personal relationship building. After October 7th, there was real silence, and I think her reflection to us was very personal. And I think it was really important for her to share that, because to understand that the United Nations is in of itself a body where countries are supposed to be able to interact in a more personal way so that we can develop relationships between countries, but it starts with the individual. There were essentially three parts to the conference, or to the panels. The first was an understanding of the problems that exist within UNRWA. And I want to just spend a couple of minutes so that we can briefly explain the role of UNRWA. The UN has several bodies. So they would have a body, for example, that deals with UNICEF and children. They have a World Food Program. They have a refugee organization. That refugee organization is called UNHCR. That handles all of the refugees around the world, other than Palestinian. UNRWA itself is the Palestinian Refugee Organization. And another thing I didn't understand about UNRWA is that it's not a needs-based organization, but rather a status-based organization. So all of those Palestinians who fled in 1948, if they can trace the line back paternally, so on their father's side, back to 48, then they have the status of refugees, which means they're entitled to aid, and most receive that aid. If you go onto the UNRWA website, for example, they would say that not everyone accesses that aid, and I'm sure that's true, especially if they live in the West. But certainly if they're living in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Egypt, in Gaza, they certainly can access that aid. And they already have been delivering significant amounts of both education and food. For example, the stats are that 60% of meals that were served in Gaza before October 7th are actually served by UNRWA. So, and all of the education, the curriculum is set by UNRWA in terms of the public schooling in Gaza. And unfortunately, and I don't know how much you know about UNRWA and its curriculum, but I would recommend that you take a look. It's well known for having problematic curricula that just promotes a radicalization or hatred of Israel, and certainly resisting against the Zionist regime, against Israel, if it even acknowledges the name of the state. So certainly there are problems within UNRWA. UNRWA is also very well placed to be able to deliver aid. And part of that is because it has a monopoly of aid in the West Bank, and certainly in Gaza, where Hamas, as the ruling organization, is pretty embedded in the organization. And that's not such a big surprise when you have this kind of a government that's not really democratic. And the last time they had an election was 2006. So I suppose my big takeaway from this conference was actually that, first of all, the UN has many bodies that could do really good things in Gaza, including UNICEF dealing with children, including their refugee organization, including the World Food Program. And that long term, certainly not short term, certainly not right now in the middle of a war, but long term, we should be thinking about ways to spread different organizations into Gaza for aid and aid delivery, so that there isn't only a monopoly of one organization that can help and then therefore be infiltrated by the terrorist group running it. And certainly, if you do, as the UN does, treat Hamas as the government, then governments should govern. So governments should be making sure that you have economy, that you are able to produce your own food, for example, and also that you are educating your people. And so some of what's happened coming out of the war itself and these attacks is that UNRWA has facilitated some of the abdication of that responsibility of governance. So long term, I think that does have to be dealt with. And certainly UNRWA is involved now in Gaza in delivering aid. One of the key points once we arrived in Israel was really to bear witness to the acts of October 7th. What I think is important for us to talk about, and maybe it's an unpopular idea, but I think while the Jewish community certainly acknowledges the terrorist acts of October 7th, we have not had as much of an emphasis on the humanitarian crisis. And the same is true in a lot of our local media, where there's a lot of emphasis on the humanitarian crisis and not very much emphasis on the hostages. And for me, this really is about trauma. And I think it's important to frame it in this way and to talk about it a bit differently, because each people has been hit exactly in their point of trauma in this conflict. And I'll explain what I mean before I move forward. So I think for Palestinians, a point of trauma historically, I mean, I'm certainly not talking about the PTSD that's involved in living in war. And I think both communities certainly experienced that level of trauma. But I'm talking about historical trauma, in that for Palestinians, with the Nakba in 1948 and being fleeing, exiled, and historically speaking, it's a mixed bag of all of those things. The displacement from your home, when culturally speaking, your home is your center, where you will live multi-generationally and then pass this home on to your children. Displacement is a major trauma. And from the beginning of this war, and we see it still even today, the displacements are a continuation of that historical trauma point. And whether or not you might argue the point, in my mind, it's the reality that's being experienced, and therefore we need to understand it if we're going to be able to see our way through. From a Jewish community perspective, our trauma is security and safety. And historically speaking, and some people might refer specifically to the Holocaust, in my mind, this goes well beyond that. All throughout our history, we are never quite safe. We never feel safe. We're never in charge of our own safety, which is why self-determination and the ability to be safe and safeguard our own security is very important to us. That's about recognizing and addressing our own trauma. So for me, these two counterpoints are critical to understand the situation right now, because there certainly is a humanitarian crisis and there is a massive amount of trauma on both sides. And it's only by understanding each community and understanding what each community needs to feel safe that I think there will be a path through. And without recognizing that, you're really just forcing the issue on each other. This photograph that you're seeing is actually a picture that I took of Gaza. So I'm standing just outside of Kfar Aza, and I took this picture with my phone. So on one point, it's to highlight how close these communities are. The fact that I could take this picture with my phone gives us an understanding of that space. It also, I think, highlights the level of destruction in these areas. Even from this far, you can see that these buildings aren't really livable anymore. And to understand the Gaza Strip as having, I mean, I think the last stat I read was that 70% of buildings have been damaged. So not necessarily completely destroyed, but are damaged and therefore probably not safe. I think is also something that certainly being in this space made me think of. So I want to first go all the way to the end, and I want to show you the map, just so that you understand and have a scale of what Israel really looks like. So I traveled on a number of spaces. This larger piece in the middle is the West Bank. Some refer to it as Judea and Samaria. A lot of the historical places that you find in the Hebrew Bible or the Torah are found in this region. The Gaza Strip is the small strip of land that is attached to both Egypt and Israel, and then is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. And Kfar Aza and these and the sites, the rest of the sites that I visited, are just on the border. Some of them only 2 kilometers from Gaza as the Strip. And how they described themselves was actually 95% heaven and 5% you have very dangerous neighbors. So just to give people a bit of a perspective. I want to stop for a super quick second. Does anyone have any questions now before moving on? No? Okay. So the first place we went to in the Gaza envelope is Kfar Aza. Kfar Aza is a beautiful, it's a beautiful kibbutz. So just to have a sense, a kibbutz is a communal, usually farm. They tend to have an industry, and most of these have socialist roots. And Kfar Aza itself, and most of these kibbutzim that were attacked that day on October 7th, were really very left-wing hippie communities. These are some of the most left-wing people in Israel who firmly believe in peace with Palestinians. Many of them had relationships or workers friends who lived in Gaza, who would work on the kibbutzim, and often they would be volunteers to help Palestinians coming from Gaza get medical care or uh, different things they might need. So this man's name is Ralph. He's lived on this kibbutz most of his life, and it's his home. We were not allowed on the kibbutz without someone who lived there. And even at that point, 2 months ago, there had started to be a debate amongst the kibbutznikim, or the people who lived on the kibbutz, that that they didn't want it to be a center for disaster tourism. And they really wanted to only have a few people come in, and to have those be guided by a resident, to be known by someone who lived there. So I feel quite fortunate to have been able to bear witness in this way. I know that there were some things that I was not allowed to see, specifically because they were deemed private by the homeowners. And in general, it was quite a moving place. I know that when I lived on kibbutz, it was a very free time in my life. And if anyone on the call knows that experience of living on these communes, just incredibly free. You feel like anywhere around you, you are safe, and you can walk into anyone's home. In Kfar Aza on October 7th, 40 people were murdered on the kibbutz from that community. 80 were wounded, 16 were taken as hostages, and still remain captives. Well, I shouldn't say that. A lot of the people who were taken captive from Kfar Aza were children and were released in the first round. So 5 remain captive, and 11 of them have been returned. So he is showing us here, if you can see in the photo, pieces of missile that had been left on his lawn. So he collected those from his house to show us. And he reflected on the whole thing. You know, there are bomb shelters everywhere on the kibbutz, and they're painted in these bright colors with mandalas and smiling faces. Because when you hear the siren in Kfar Aza, you have 15 seconds to get into a shelter. And as we drove in, I sort of had this reflection of 15 seconds. And they were like, don't worry, we'll tell you what to do. And in my own mind, it was like, they'll tell me what to do. Like, in 15 seconds, can you even process the information to be able to understand the instructions? Like, 15 seconds is really no time, especially if you're traveling in a group like we were. So the amount of sort of the efforts that they've taken to lead a normal life under these circumstances are quite significant. And what he was showing us was all of the everything that was designed for their safety was really designed with one thing in mind, and that's missiles coming from above, which is why they were really powerless to stop what happened on that day. So these are photos just of our tour of Kfar Aza. You can see the level of destruction that happened with the bombings, but also this was part of the rescue operation, and I wanted to highlight this. So as you're walking through, it's a little bit like a moment in time. There's still sukkot, like sukkahs that are up, because it happened right on the last day of Sukkot. So the whole kibbutz is frozen, and there's graffiti everywhere. And we were asking what it meant. And these are IDF graffiti talking about how many terrorists were seen in the building, or how many people were kept inside. So because everything was protected from above, they didn't really have locks on the doors, and most of the people in the kibbutz literally had to close the doors with their own hands and arms, with all of the threats of violence and shots, and literally people shooting at them through the doors while they tried to hold it closed. So the amount of fear that he was expressing was really palatable. It was something you could feel as you went through it. We then stopped off at Sderot. So Sderot is also almost just a few kilometers from the border. Sderot is the largest town in what's called the Gaza envelope, or the area around Gaza. And it was the center for first response. This was actually um, the first target when the Hamas terrorists crossed the fence. So on October 7th at about 5:30 in the morning, you had between 3,000 and 4,000 terrorists cross the fence. Their first stop was Sderot, the police station, because that was the central command for urgent response for the entire region. So people asked later on, like, why did it take so long to respond? How come the army wasn't there? How come police rescue services weren't there? And the answer actually is that they took out the first responders first. Clearly, they had intelligence. They knew where the armory was. They knew where the command centers were. And they had a massive attack on this one space. So when we pulled up and were sort of given a lowdown on what happened that day, we saw a bunch of new recruits. So these are the soldiers that are coming to sort of hear the story of what happened that day. On the wall behind them, you can see a mural painted. And I don't know if it's so clear in the picture, but there is a Torah scroll on the back on top of a building, and there are Hebrew letters that are coming up almost like smoke. And those Hebrew letters are actually covering up bullet holes in that wall. And by bullet holes, I sometimes mean very large. I mean, these are sort of, they used RPGs and they used a lot of large weaponry to be able to really destroy the building and take out as many of the urgent response teams as possible so that they could get as far into Israel as possible. We went to the Nova site next, which is the site of the music festival that took place there. And to be honest, when we went, I personally felt like this would be a contrived experience, but it was actually very organic and emotional. I know in my own youth, I was at the best party I've ever been to in my life in Israel. And it was similar to this, right? There's just this feeling of being able to be really free and dancing and feeling like you're just part of everything in the world, so vibrantly alive. And this was a music all night festival, all about peace and love. There were many hundreds of people there, and um, and this was an accident. This wasn't targeted like the police station. They actually were supposed to have been at a different site, and the site moved. So this was total innocence, an accident on the part of the terrorists coming in, but really this whole experience, it felt like such an incredible waste, like such a loss for nothing. That to me it felt very emotional and organic to be there. And certainly there was us and another group who were visiting the site, but there were lots of Israelis just holding music, playing out of little speakers, or just walking around. There were religious people there. Like, it was a huge mixture of Israeli society just sort of continuing to mourn. And they had each one was sort of individualized based on who they were. So it had personal mementos or items, but also reference to whether they had been killed or if they were still hostages. So just to understand this, the enormity of it, 350 people were murdered here, and more than 40 hostages were taken from the Nova site. So this was the site actually of the most hostages taken, all young men and women, all civilians. The hostage forums, this is actually a photograph of a protest demonstration on behalf of the hostages that we saw. And we heard some very impactful stories from them. So our route was sort of interrupted. We ended up on the side of the road waiting for them to pass. But then later on, afterwards, when we returned to Tel Aviv, we met with the Hostage Forum, which is like an umbrella organization intended to advocate or facilitate fundraising, or if they needed anything specifically for the families, or for people who had been returned, who were injured, for their rehabilitations. So there's one sort of body, and that body is called the Hostage Forum. When we were there, we heard from 3 different family members of hostages, but there's one that really struck me as being very important. I wanted to share with you. So I had actually read the story of many of the hostages as they were returned in that first round. And a lot of the Israeli media was definitely showing it in a very caring and emotional way. So there were 2 boys who were returned, teenage boys. One was 15 and one was 17. So these are the same ages as my 2 boys. And they had been kept with a man named Yossi Sharabi. So Eli Sharabi is the brother of Yossi. Yossi was killed while he was being held hostage. But he had, Eli was telling the story and saying that his brother had even refused his own food, sharing it with others so that they would have more strength. And I sort of perked up, like, this is the story that I knew. So Yossi had, because he was with these 2 boys, he would give them his rations of food when they had it, to really strengthen not just their physical selves, but emotionally, to say, we're going to get out of this, like, you're going to be okay. And so the 2 boys were interviewed when they were released. And they said that really Yossi saved their lives, like, in more ways than one, because it was so, they needed someone to let them know that things were going to be okay. And he was that person for them. And they were reacting to the news that he had been killed in Gaza. And so Ellie, who was telling us the story of his brother, but really didn't speak very much English, and he was quite emotional, but wanted to really try in his best English to do it. And he said, it strengthens me to give talks to groups from around the world who are coming here to see, because it means to me this is about kind of our collective nature as Jews around the world. And this is the spirit of us. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, I really just want to hold your hand and know that I heard your brother's story. And to me, when I think about how we're all going to get through this, I actually think about your brother, right? That selflessness of to be able to say, I'm retaining my humanity in this situation. So we know now, and I didn't know this then, but of course now more of the hostages are beginning to speak, and the released hostages, about their experiences and what happened to them there, and the sexual abuse, but also just general fear and the conditions they were in. And what we were told there by the Hostage Forum was that many of them had been threatened. So if you remember, most of the hostages were taken out of their homes in these little kibbutzim or moshavim. So often if a woman was released and her husband was still kept hostage, then she wasn't willing to speak out about the conditions because she was afraid about what would happen to her family members who were there, a child or a spouse. So it's only, even now, things are only being revealed because of that emotional torture, I guess you could say. When we returned, this is a picture of our delegation, and it was really interesting. Like, some of the pictures I really can't show you just due to security concerns, but these are 2 high-level officials. So the picture on your left is our complete delegation. So again, this is leadership from across the country. I'm one of the babies of the group, you can tell. The man who's in the center right by the Canadian flag is Yuli Edelstein, who's a former speaker of the Knesset and member of the Knesset. He has a very long history. He's quite a famous Israeli politician. And on the right, the man is right under the Israeli flag, or right in front of it. is Amir Ohana. So Amir, it's interesting, like he's introduced as the first openly gay right-wing Knesset member, which is sort of funny because certainly he's not the first member of the LGBTQ community who is a member of Knesset. But to be on the right wing is a bit unusual. He is now currently the Speaker of the Knesset and an MK. And he really had some interesting things to say about the Canadian-Israeli relationship. We also heard from academics, from political analysts, from military strategists, even from the Office of the Prime Minister, to understand how they were viewing the military strategy moving forward, and also to understand, I guess, their perspective. And certainly, having seen the sites, we understood the context of why it was that people were feeling like they couldn't go back to their homes. And they needed to know that they were secure. But it also, to me, when we were talking with Ralph on Kfar Aza, for example, he talked really about how the social contract between the government, the IDF, and the people living in these areas had been broken. And I think this is really important for us also to understand when we're thinking about the conflict now, how to understand what's happening even today, is to understand that the social contract has been broken. And Israelis effectively are feeling both unsafe and unsure if they can really trust that the government can keep them safe. Whereas before they were under the impression that absolutely we feel safe here and there's the Iron Dome and there's the IDF. And maybe that's not as true. And I think, again, whether or not we want that to be true, I think we have to recognize that it's true in order to work our way through what's happening. For me, there's also a major diplomatic piece, and we went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and spoke with some of the diplomats who were in charge of the North American team. Pictured on the left are first sort of in the middle are two members of Knesset, strong women, and I had some really harsh questions for them. So the woman who's on the center left, which is sort of ironic because politically she's there as well, is called Sharon Haskell. So I've seen Sharon speak before. Her English is very good. She grew up in the States at some points, and and even spent some time in Ontario as well. She's part of the New Hope party, which is run by Gideon Saar, and certainly was in the army, especially was a military commander in the Second Intifada. She speaks very clearly, but she started out kind of center, and really remains there, I would say, politically. The woman on the right on the screen, her name is Orit Farkash HaKohen. She is part of what's called the National Unity Party under Benny Gantz. And it was funny, I was sitting next to her assistant and I was like, tell me, how are people feeling about Bibi? And she was like, well, it's the only thing we agree on, which I think was really interesting, that Israelis themselves are talking about needing a change in leadership. And me sort of asking the question, well, how do you get there, right? How do you get there? The photo on the right is me with President of Israel, Bougie Isaac Herzog. This was also a really interesting conversation. We were there in the morning, the delegation, and there was a Canadian minister coming, and he was sort of like, what do we do? What do we talk about? What's the important thing to emphasize when we have this short time? And as someone in the group said, it's important to have her meet with women. And he took this to mean to talk about sexual violence on October 7th. And actually, I said, no, it's not actually only about sexual violence, but actually you have strong women in your government and they should be a voice. in many respects, I think we've seen, at least from a Canadian perspective, we've seen too many of the old, of an older generation, very male, and very harsh sounding, talking about the plans of Israel and what Israel's going to do. And they're speaking, when they speak to us in English, I think they need to speak to us as Canadians and how we need to hear. And I stress this very much, especially to these two Knesset members. And I challenge them to have us hear their voices because, frankly, we need to hear them, and it needs to come from them if we're going to be able to hear them in a more complete way, certainly in North America. And they're already doing the work, so how come they can't also be empowered to speak and to speak out? So those were some really interesting conversations. The formal mission ended there, and I took the opportunity of being in the region to extend a bit and go and see some friends of mine. Corey Gill Schuster is he said to me, he defined himself as one of the last left wingers left in Israel, and he's a very funny, intelligent, irreverent guy who lives in Tel Aviv. He actually runs the Peace and Conflict Resolution Studies program at University of Tel Aviv. And he has run for the last number of years, I think he said 8 years, a YouTube channel called Ask an Israeli, Ask a Palestinian. I first met Corey because I was a fan of the channel. And I really feel like I learned the most about the conflict itself from him. But what I had tried to do was just watch everything a few years ago. And in 2018, when I went to Israel to start a deep dive on the conflict, I asked him if I could sponsor a video and go with him to film. We went into the West Bank, and this was really a fantastic experience in being able to listen to other people's narratives. And Corey is a believer in reality. So he has sort of a code for his own films, which means he edits them together, but he doesn't edit out anyone's statements. He believes that people are entitled to hear everything and to say whatever they like. So he receives questions from the internet. You can send him a question of your own if you'd like. And then he asks those questions. So sometimes they're just for an Israeli or just for a Palestinian, but typically he likes questions where he gets to ask the same question to both sides. And he's a little bit fearless, which we sort of joke that we're a bit of a dynamic duo because there aren't any breaks when we're together. But even now, at this time in February and March, he wasn't willing or able to go into the West Bank as an Israeli citizen. He's actually Canadian Israeli, but he was able to go into Arab Israeli towns. So we spent a day filming in Arab Israeli towns and villages north of Tel Aviv. It's interesting talking to someone who is really interested in people and in truth because he's not afraid to ask things, but he also wants to empower people to have a voice. And sometimes it's harder to do that. Sometimes people feel less like they're able to have that voice. So he actually finds that having a woman be with him makes it easier for women to talk to him, or easier he often finds in Arab communities, it's up to the male in the room whether or not the women will speak to him. But certainly having a woman be there, sort of a disarming function of being there. It was interesting in part because none of his questions, I had prepared a series of questions about the conflict and about how people were feeling. And I took a look through his book and his questions, and I was like, Corey, you aren't asking a single question about October 7th or how people are feeling or if they feel like Israel has changed. And he was like, well, yeah. I mean, It takes a lot of time, and then you have a time-specific video that isn't relevant. And I sort of convinced him throughout that day that actually we were in a very specific moment in time that was likely to change everything, and that it was worth capturing some people's thoughts. So he actually did a video of just me asking my questions on this day about how people were feeling. What was interesting, and he was sort of translating as we went, but how many, and we were asking a mixed bag of both Israelis and Arab Israelis, like Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis. These are very integrated communities. Most Arab Israelis living in these towns and villages consider themselves to be Israelis. They work with Jewish Israelis, they work in Israel, they live in Israel. Most of them have citizenship from Israel. And it's important to sort of understand that Palestinians themselves and Arabs are sort of at different categories. So most Arab Israelis who we were filming and talking to would be considered what's called a 48 Arab, meaning that they stayed under Israeli rule in 1948, and then therefore were able to have citizenship. They're able not only to vote or to serve in the army if they choose, but also they're able to run for office, able to hold major positions in government. So these are very integrated. What I heard from them on this day was a lot of fear, actually. They were reflecting both on the weeks that happened in the first few weeks after October 7th. Many of them were asked just to stay home or to take a leave of absence because there was such a feeling of fear. And it was hard for me to hear that, actually, that to know that there was this sort of perspective of such a lack of trust that people would just take a step back from each other, even if they had been friends for years. And some of the, I remember speaking to a mom, she had her kid in the car with her, and she was saying that there was quite a lot of fear, even of just going to the park, that they stayed home for a few weeks when it was very fresh because they were worried about interactions. And she didn't say that there were problems, but she was worried about problems. And for me, I think this fear of the other, even within a very integrated population, is something that we really have to think about from a long-term perspective of what does integration really mean and how do we build trust with each other within, in particular, this population that should have equal access, equal rights to all things. Corey convinced me to go into Ramallah, and I want to highlight, so I've mentioned that there are 48 Arabs. There are also what's known as 67 Arabs who mainly live in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalemites have the option to apply for citizenship, but many do not take it. They are residents of Jerusalem, but not citizens. So that means that they can vote in municipal elections, but not in national elections. And their passports are Jordanian passports and not Israeli passports, which was also interesting. But in 67, they were citizens of Jordan. So that's why they can have Jordanian passports. My main driver was a 67 Arab and an East Jerusalemite. And this was I actually spent more time with my driver than with anyone else. So this was very interesting to be able to get his perspective and to tell him about my trip and really process it with him. So this is graffiti that's just right at the border, at the checkpoint where you cross in when you're leaving Ramallah. It's a picture of Yasser Arafat, but it actually says next to it, "Free Barghouti." Marwan Barghouti is known to be the leader of the two intifadas, the first and second intifada, and he's been jailed in Israel since 2002. So if you follow the politics, Israeli politics closely, then you'll see that there have been calls to free Marwan Barghouti in the hopes that he may be a leader who is both respected by the PA Fatah and by Hamas, because he is sort of in between their positions. Israel maintains, of course, that he is a long history of murder behind him. He even called for a third intifada in 2014. But I think it's interesting. I spoke with many Palestinians and Arabs, and I heard Barghouti's name most often when I asked them, "Who is your next leader? Who is the successor to Mahmoud Abbas?" His was the name that I heard most. I think what's most important for me to clarify here is that when you watch the news in Canada, we see the most extreme perspectives. We see the most extreme perspectives from Israeli society and the most extreme perspectives from Palestinian society. And for me on this trip, what was really important to me was that I could participate and seek out diverse voices, because there certainly are many perspectives and many different options that the Palestinian people could choose to take. The problem is that they don't have a real fulsome democracy. And so a lot of those voices are silenced. Even when I had the conversations of who could be your next leader to take over from Mahmoud Abbas, even over the last few years when I asked that question, I was told again and again, any leaders who are really coming up are often silenced in this way. They're silenced and maybe even eliminated because there isn't a large desire to see democratic elections or to lose power. But that doesn't discount those important voices, or that we have to actively try harder to hear them. In fact, I would say that's the reason it's important. I just want to stop a quick second. Oh, okay. So the first person I spoke with is actually really interesting. So this is Ibrahim Abu Ahmad. Ibrahim is a 48 Arab. He's totally integrated, lives in Israel, in Netanya. He runs a podcast called Unapologetic that I certainly don't agree with everything he says, but I would highly recommend listening to it. It's him and a friend of his who's a 67 Arab, and they share their own diverse perspectives. Ibrahim would refer to himself as a Palestinian Israeli, which is, he feels, a term he's coined himself. But he really feels like he has that this mix, those Arab Israelis who identify also as Palestinian, have a lot to say about the conflict because they can see it from both sides. And when I met with him, he talked about October 7th and how he knew people who were killed that day. He knew people who were called up to war that day. And he also watched in horror as the response started to happen. And he knew people who were in Gaza or who had family in Gaza, and that he sort of felt really torn on both sides. There are two things that I would want to quote him on that he says over and over in his podcast that he said to me. And I asked him to sort of elaborate a bit on those points. But something he says often is that we all deserve better. And I sort of love this idea, right? To recognize that the conflict hurts everyone, not just Palestinians, not just Israelis, but the conflict really hurts everyone. So in his view, coexistence is really the only option. Now, Abraham works for an organization called Roots. This is part of the coexistence peace movement in Israel. For the most part, he is secular, he's very left-wing, and he has many left-wing Israeli friends. I think he's also felt uncomfortable, I guess, with this shift. And in the beginning, he felt like a little afraid. I even reached out to him in the weeks after October 7th, just to say, I hope you and your family are okay. And he said, we're really just sticking close to home because it's scary to go out when you don't know what's going to happen. If someone hears your accent, if someone hears where you're from, or makes an assumption about you. So this was a really interesting conversation with him. I also know that he had some difficult conversations with Israeli friends, and he is the one person who was recommended to me by both Palestinian friends and Israeli friends, even through CIJA. So we both were like, oh, if all of these very disparate people recommended that we talk to each other, then I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. But I know that for lots of people, for lots of Israelis, they felt like if he's actively trying to help raise funds to help get people out of Gaza, then maybe he's not on our side. Like if this is such an integrated person who we thought was so Israeli and isn't Israeli, doesn't identify in this way, then maybe he's dangerous. And I know it's difficult. This is, I think, from all of the different Arab perspectives that I heard, there was the most tension in this group of people feeling like some Israeli Arabs felt very much like I'm Israeli, 100% Israeli today. And others really felt like there were parts of themselves they had to hide, or that they couldn't speak, or they couldn't, or that they could be critical of the war, but only referencing the hostages. For sure, this guy has political aspirations, and I hope as he gets older and more politically mature that we actually see him in Israeli politics, because meeting him was a real highlight. And it's interesting because on the plane to Israel, a young woman who was making Aliyah, we were sitting next to each other and talking, and she recommended his podcast to me. And I laughed and I said, I'm actually meeting this guy tomorrow. And she was like all aflutter with fandom, to be able to know that she was knowing someone who was going to meet him. So to me, that also spoke to, and she was a young diaspora Jew from the UK, um, who really felt like, his podcast is in English and that he's speaking to a younger generation about the possibility of coexistence, which for me was very heartening. This is my friend Sami Awad. So Sami and Sami is one of my oldest friends, actually. Sami is a Christian Palestinian from Bethlehem. We met on a peace tour in 1987 when we were teenagers before the first Intifada. And I think, Sami, he's a person that every time I am in Israel, I try to see him. I try to see him, and I try to see Corey, and I try to see my best friend Raya. And they are my triangulation point. I'm able to see myself in a lot of ways in this, in understanding where is the street, right? Where is the Israeli street? Where's the Palestinian street? And then maybe where am I? Sami is definitely not. So he is a refugee. He traces his paternal line back to Jerusalem, or on the outskirts of Jerusalem, through his grandfather. And he is someone who he has status with UNRWA. He definitely is not a Zionist. He's definitely not pro-Israel. But something that we 100% share is the path of nonviolence. So I would call Sami a nonviolent peace activist, where certainly he would talk about his nonviolence as being resistance. And we have very different ideas about what a solution could be or how it might work. But he founded the Holy Land Trust, which he no longer works for them, but he certainly, that was his baby for a long time. And in all of my research the last 7 years that I've been on sort of a deep dive about the conflict, I could find very few organizations that were willing to work with Jews, with Israeli Jews, with diaspora Jews. And for the most part, if they were willing to work with Jewish organizations, they would be willing only to work with Jews who agree with them, who would consider themselves to be anti-Zionist. And Sammy is really rare in that he is willing to speak to people who disagree. He believes in the process of building relationships and trying to build understanding, also really through the lens of understanding shared traumas of living in the region. We had really interesting conversation. I mean, in general, I think ever since we were teens, we think about each other as someone we care about, and therefore we can see the humanity in the other, or rather never saw the other community as other, right? We always really had a shared compassion for each other through this young friendship. The most interesting conversation that we had on this trip was about exaggeration and the problems with using words that exaggerate or media that exaggerates instead of trying to show the middle ground or trying to show the reality as it is. And we were talking about the term genocide. And from my perspective, I said, what's happening now isn't what genocide means. Genocide is really talking about eliminating an entire race, and this isn't what's happening. My worry is that when you push so hard with an exaggerated idea, that then the counter push also is exaggerated. So if we can say, if there is a group of people saying Israel or all Zionists are seeking genocide upon the Palestinian people, which is not what's happening, by every statement from the Jewish perspective, this is about eliminating Hamas as a political, as a military function, if not as an ideology or ideological movement. But then you have to exaggerate and say, well, Israel is perfect and has been executing this war perfectly, which, of course, Sammy and I agree it hasn't. And I think most people would agree that Israel hasn't executed this war perfectly. In fact, I don't know if it would even be possible to do such a thing. So I've reflected on this conversation many times, actually, in the last couple of months about how media representations, particularly social media, but even regular media, has this element of exaggeration or emphasizing the extremes that don't allow for the room that actual peace building requires. Because peacemaking requires some room to have conversation, to have agreement, to come to understandings. And the need to defend and to over defend against accusations that are over exaggerated don't really lead to any conversation that is based on any reality whatsoever. So for me, this is a very important conversation to discuss. And despite the fact that there's lots that we disagree about, we've been friends a long, long time, and that matters, I think, to both of us for sure. My last stop was, I'm going to call her M. This is a Muslim Palestinian who lives in Ramallah. I worked on a project with her in the West Bank several years ago. And originally I had tried to reach out to her to speak to her on my first planned trip in October. And we had this sort of wonderful plan of, she was like, okay, you want me to find you people who are going to say they like coexistence? I'm like, no, I want to just take you to your favorite restaurants. I want to hang out with you. I want to be a fly on the wall. If your friends want to meet me and hang out, that sounds awesome, but I'm not requiring that of you. I just want to experience spending a day with you, and I'll pay you your rates for work because I don't want you to be out of work a day. So she laughed and she was like, no, you should stay over. I'll take you to my favorite restaurant. Like, you are my guest. But if you really want to be a fly on the wall and I get a job, like you can come with me. So I just thought it was, so this was just really hanging out with someone who I initially had a very lovely connection with. She's 38, single, living at home, and she is brilliant, speaks a number of languages, and someone who has really interesting perspectives. She was the only person who was actually cautious or maybe even a little fearful of meeting with me. She acknowledged the risk, both to herself and to me. So it took me 2.5 hours each way to get to Ramallah, which should be a 45 to 60-minute drive, because the checkpoints were closed and different routes were closed because of the war. But I did get to spend about 2 hours in Ramallah with her, and we talked a lot about the situation on the ground. And this to me was really interesting because it was frank. She was worried that because we were driving with Israeli plates, because Israeli Arabs, who are the majority of the taxi drivers, still had Israeli plates. And she felt like there was a risk that we would actually have been shot at on the road. I told her that I wasn't worried about this as much as I was worried about what might happen to her if it's known that she speaks with me. And um, and I think in that moment, we sort of saw each other in a different way, right? We saw each other in a way of like, our actual concern was for each other in being able to talk and to recognize the risk that was involved in speaking, and how, like, truthfully unfortunate that is. When we were talking, I said, I had seen a poll that actually Hamas and support for Hamas had grown in popularity in the West Bank. And I asked her if this was true. And she said, unfortunately, it is true. And when I asked her why, she felt, because I was like, look, I literally took a picture of Gaza. This place is destroyed. Like, how can this be a choice that makes any sense to you? And I actually quoted Ibrahim when he said something he says often, like, every time Palestinians choose violence, they lose land and they lose rights. Although I would maybe take issue with that statement and say they lose freedoms. And she said, yes, that's true, but also it's true that there is a large percentage of people here who want to see Israel suffer. And Hamas made them suffer on that day. And so that increased their popularity. So as we talked about that a little bit more, and she also said that for most people in the West Bank, that their salaries had been reduced to 60%. And she was talking about how it's becoming harder and harder to make ends meet. There's no social safety net there. There's no, there's no CERB, there's no EI, there's no welfare system. And so she talked about most people wanting to go back to work, but on the other hand, not really being willing to talk about a future where people stop fighting. And I said, I can you explain to me this identity? Like, she referred to her identity as a Palestinian, particularly in response to my questions around UNRWA, that UNRWA in the curriculum was teaching them resistance as identity. And I said, but if your identity is resistance, how will you ever stop fighting? And she stopped me and she said, is it out of respect for me that you're calling it resistance instead of terrorism? Like, is that what you believe, or is that you trying to show me respect? And my response was only, I do want to show you respect and use language that you're comfortable with. But on the other hand, it's my personal opinion that whether you call it terrorism or you call it resistance, if the only path you choose as an identity piece is to fight forever, then that either way is the antithesis to peace. And so what is the big goal? Is it possible that people here will choose peace, will choose leadership and government that seeks peace? Or is it whatever word you call it? Is it to seek continual state of fighting? She didn't have an answer for me, and I think that's okay. That's probably best for a second conversation. She did say, as I was sort of going by and I was pitching this idea of bringing others with me to try to have a trip that humanized both sides, where people could meet and really understand that there were human beings on both sides. She was willing to be involved in some way, although we would need a workaround to have it be safe for her. But in the end, when I was getting back in the taxi and she gave me a big hug and she said, "Thank you for coming and listening." It just shows that there are still people out there that have an open mind and an open heart. And I was like, for you too, right? I understand the risk that you took in meeting with me, that it's not nothing just to go for coffee, but it actually is a very big step towards the average person. And I was encouraging her that even if she was to come and help on a project, that it's actually her voice that I wanted to hear, because she was like, I could translate for someone, I could, you know, take notes. I was like, it's actually, however we would pitch it, it's your voice that I think deserves to be heard, as someone who's lived in the West, as someone who knows Israelis and works with Israelis. It's important too to have this side be seen. This is my closest friend in Israel. Her name is Raya. She has 3 daughters, and every time I'm there, I go and stay with her. Raya lives in a settlement called Gush Etzion, and we hear a lot in the news about settlements, but actually, the settlements in Israel can mean a variety of things. Gush Etzion is a bedroom community of Jerusalem. It's a very old settlement, one of the oldest. It's actually considered to be a pretty liberal settlement as far as they go, and she's kind of one of the hippies of that liberal settlement. But it's still in the West Bank. It's still beyond the Green Line. There's still quite a lot of security that they need there. In any deal that's ever been discussed for a two-state solution, Gush Etzion would always have ended up as part of Israeli territory, which is probably why they're a little more liberal. It is certainly, some of the settlements are, although the UN would consider them all to be illegal, there are legal settlements in Israel and illegal outposts. And Gush Etzion is very well established legal settlement. When I was first contacting her, and I would check in periodically about how she was doing, she was like, there was no talk about me coming. In fact, there was even some talk about she would just come and visit me and maybe go out for dinner in Jerusalem, but not to have me stay as I usually do. And then when I was there, it was interesting not only to talk with her, and I was asking her specifically about some of the more right-wing coalition leaders like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, that to North Americans, they're very unpalatable as hardcore right-wingers. And I asked her what was the feeling on the settlement about these guys. So typically, Gush Etzion would not have had very many supporters of these hard-lined right-wing settlement leaders. And her response was, she's not sure what she thinks anymore. She was like, 2 years ago, I would have said I hate those guys, and now the circumstances feel changed, because in Israel, right and left has very little to do with economics, has very little to do with social identity the way it does here. In Israel, these attitudes are really about security and how far you're willing to go to feel safe. It was interesting also because I've known the kids since they were literally babies. They felt comfortable answering my questions. And I thought it was quite interesting. Their teen, who's the same age as my oldest, at 17, lives a lot of her life in an international space. And she felt very victimized on the internet, that people would literally talk about how horrible she was just for being Israeli, people who had never met her. And as she was describing this, and she was quite distraught about it. And I said, you know, you're having a diaspora experience while you're living in Israel. Like it's like the one thing you have going for you right now as a Jewish person you don't have, because you're interacting in this international way. The kids were finally, and I say this like after 4 months, we're finally feeling more safe in their space, safe in terms of the war. They weren't feeling as affected by it, but certainly the teenager um, who was living this international experience could definitely feel it. We, as we walked around the kibbutz, not the kibbutz, the settlement, she was telling me about the first weeks that were happening after October 7th, and how everything in Israel felt this way, but for sure in this small community where everyone knows each other, that she said it became a settlement of women because everyone had gone off to war, and and that this sense of fear, but also of intense community and belonging, were sort of part of that experience, and that people had really come together in this way. Now, ironically, she lives probably 20 minutes from my friend Sammy, and these are the only place that they could possibly meet would be in a parking lot of the shopping mall where both people could go. So for me, when I see these two, it's an important juxtaposition for me, because it's two people I really care about, who I've known for a long time, um, who are sort of living on literally the other side of a fence, but also in totally different worlds. And I was able to go up north and to our partnership region. And some of these, so I've edited this picture out. Um, so we have a partnership in Halifax and actually small communities across Canada with the far north. We're sort of have not areas from a Canadian perspective, also have not areas from an Israeli perspective. Um, most of these people, about half of the people who met for lunch, were actually evacuated from their homes, so came in from their temporary homes to come meet. They also arranged for the commander of the Northern Front to come and give me a military briefing, which I thought was, which was really fascinating. And even in that briefing, some of the Israelis who were living in the area then really jumped in to have a heated political debate about, well, why are you doing this and not that? Why aren't you going into Lebanon? So that we can feel safe to go back to our homes. And I think in many respects, part of what was happening in the north and the decision of the Israeli army to focus on Gaza, and only sort of play defensively in the north, is that there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who are evacuated. In fact, when I was staying in Tel Aviv, the hotel that I was in was 90% evacuees. And they've been displaced for 7 months. So their feeling of limbo, like we actually have our Hebrew school as a shared Hebrew school with the school in this region. So we had a lot of conversations about how it felt to sort of be in limbo, and also what we could do as communities to be able to be connected, to feel connected, even in this very disorienting time. We also talked about being underrepresented, and the voice of some really strong, powerful women here, and what kinds of projects we could do, and maybe even how or whether or not the Canadian ambassador could facilitate some of those projects. Because I know when she was up there in the north, she was very impressed with some of the Canadian projects that we had been doing, particularly those that are open to everyone, not only to Israeli Jews, but to Christians, Muslims, Druze who live in the region. I have a new organization that I've fallen in love with. It's called the Jerusalem Foundation. They're a foundation that operates obviously out of Jerusalem, and they really focus on supporting civil society. So when I met them, they had arranged for me to tour probably 7 of their 500 projects that they do, and they had me at the first one. And I'll tell you this brief story. This organization works in East Jerusalem. It's entirely Palestinian, entirely women-led. They were having a problem with the municipality, that they weren't fixing broken streetlights, that there were potholes, and they were saying, like, nothing's ever fixed around here. We're second-class citizens. No one ever does anything. And so when the foundation went to the municipality and complained, they said, well, we're complaint driven. So if they don't complain to us, we don't know about it, and therefore we don't do it. So they started an organization that receives funding from the Jerusalem Foundation, where women are paid to complain. They complain to the government, and then they have to call back in with a complaint number. And then the organization tracks whether or not those complaints were addressed by the municipality. And this effectively does 2 things. It fixes up their neighborhoods and gives accountability to the municipality and their actions. But it also empowers these women who, within even their own society, have very little power. And they actually are able to see, not only do they have a voice, but that their voice can bring about constructive, positive change for their communities. And to me, this was so powerful. We spent the day touring. We saw all kinds of beautiful arts venues, women's projects, religious pluralism, all different kinds of essentially fighting for diversity, and also supporting young leaders to be able to step up and bring new leadership ideas to the country. So in as much as, when I talk to different Palestinians or Arab Israelis, to say there are other voices out there other than the voices of Hamas. There are also other voices out there in Israel other than just a coalition government or a war cabinet. And I think for me, this was a big takeaway, that we need to understand Israel as a complex and dynamic place where we have to be empowering voices, but that there are lots of voices to empower that have good and positive ideas about what the future could be. I met with Lisa Saddlebauer. She is the Canadian ambassador to Israel. And she was here over last summer. We spent a couple of days together talking about potential projects, particularly around women and empowering women's voices. The interesting thing about Ambassador Saddlebauer is that she was in Israel in the early 90s, right before Oslo. And when she talks about that time as being tremendously hopeful, to have all of this potential for egalitarian practice for women, for religious pluralism, for partnership, and eventually a 2-state solution, there was just so much hope at that time. And I think coming back as a seasoned diplomat, full circle to now, there were many frustrations for her, and I understand them given the context of that experience. We talked a lot about women's voices and why that's important. In fact, she gave me the statistic that when women are involved in the negotiation teams or mediation teams, or involved in preparing truces, that they tend to last 30% longer than if they aren't there. And to me, that was actually very inspiring to hear, but I could see also that she was very frustrated with the lack of intentionality when I asked her about the war cabinet or the spokespeople, or, where were the women in this process? Where was she at in her file? And she laughed and she's like, I'm nowhere on that file. So for me, I think this is very important to stress, and I personally stressed it with the diplomats and the ministers that we met, because I think that is really important to understand in our own capacity to move forward. She talked a lot about the shifting geopolitics. And I think even looking at the media that we can see, I think we have to understand it in a geopolitical context. And Canada is still trying to figure out what we're doing. Canada's still trying to figure out what side we're on as this shifts. I heard this not only from Ambassador Saddlemauer in indirect ways, but also from the Canadian ambassador to the UN in Geneva. So I understand that our foreign policy right now is in a bit of flux. And this was 2 months ago we had this conversation, and certainly how that's played out, I think it's played out in important ways. But often when I'm reading the news, I think about it in this context of these ambassadors being clear that the global order is changing and Canada doesn't quite know where it's going to be. I think what's really important in the end as well, and the ambassador is leaving in June, and as far as I know, there isn't another Canadian ambassador. But we talked a lot about not only empowering women to be part of diplomacy or foreign service, but also about believing women. And she said, we were talking a bit about UNRWA and the bias of the UN. She said she didn't believe at first that the UN was biased, and that her biggest shock since October 7th was seeing that UN women took so long to be able to admit about the sexual violence and rape that had happened on October 7th. And she said this was the first time that she really saw the bias, and that she, in the beginning when she was overwhelmed with Canadians trying to leave the region in October and even early November, that it hadn't been her focus. And once she was made aware of it and started looking into it, that she came out very firmly on social media and in press releases that she personally believed Israeli women and that Canada believes Israeli women. So I know that there may be some people who would have wanted her to do more, but actually I think she certainly inspired me in lots of ways to be able to think about the importance of both protecting women in societies and also protecting women's voices in democracies and what that can look like. So that is the end of my presentation. I wanted to open it up to some questions, at least for the next, 20 minutes or so, for as long as you wanted to speak. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask about? Or a comment?
I just want to say thank you very much, Joanna, and I and many people around me have been called one of the liberal, Western people who don't understand what's going on in Israel. And particularly since October 7th, I've been trying really hard to see things, to understand how Israelis see things, and like what life is like for my sister. But yet I also, it still hurts all of us to see Gazans killed and to see them losing their place. And coming from the outside, this concept that it seems to me obvious that if you like the IDF hurts so many Gazans and so many Gazan children see it, that you're going to raise terrorists or resistance fighters or what have you. And I just want to, it's hard to know how to be a good human. And I think you're helping me to know how to be a good human. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think I mean, I don't know anyone from any community who wants to see what we're seeing on our television screens, who want to see this obvious humanitarian crisis. And I think, unfortunately, and again, it kind of goes back to that exaggeration principle, that if you're pushed into a corner to say, well, this is a genocide, and then you have people who are reacting that to say, no, we're doing everything we can to protect every civilian. And, the truth is, war is terrible. War is terrible. And if we could call for a ceasefire right now, where Hamas would also have a ceasefire, because just last week there were barrages of missiles from Rafah into central Israel. So if you could have a ceasefire on both sides and a release of all of the hostages, and actually take a look at what peace might look like in a day after, I think many, many people on both sides would want that. But it requires both sides to choose peace, right? It requires both sides to choose peace. And that's hard to do. So, yeah, thank you. Sherry, Yael?
Yeah, first I want to say thank you. The scope of people that you met with and the perspective that you're able to convey just passionately and articulately was really very beautiful. There's a number of people I know who would appreciate hearing some of your perspectives. Can I send you a note to please send a link to the recording to this?
Yes, absolutely. Anyone else want to share some perspectives or even how they're feeling about what's happening?
I think it was really brave to go into West Bank.
Thanks, Oliver.
And you and Ezra's birthday is also coming up, so I look forward to see you there.
Good. I'm glad you're going to come. That's awesome. Yeah, I think it was funny because probably the most, I did not feel what I would say to other people when they were like, what do you mean you're going into the West Bank? That seems crazy. I was always in the West Bank with someone that I knew and trusted. And I think for me being there, I felt safe. The only part that I felt in danger was actually driving through the West Bank. And when Em said to me, like, and she actually whispered it. We were in a trendy restaurant, and she whispered it. She's like, like you could have been in danger, like from our side. And I think it's, even just that recognition of the aggression, right? Because sometimes that's very hard to be able to admit. Coming from your side, seeing the aggression from your side, that's painful, I think, as an admission as human beings. But having her recognize that also was very affirming. So I can tell you, I appreciate you calling me brave, but honestly, I didn't, for the most part, I really felt safe because I was with people that I trusted.
Go ahead, Ruth.
I have to say, it really was a wonderful, if I weren't your mother, it would be the way that you reached out to as wide a range of people and people's opinions was awesome. But made me very glad you're back home.
Thanks, Mom.
I would like to say, Joanna,
was just really impressed with everything that you had to say and how you conducted yourself and how you did this presentation. I was very, very moved. I'm wondering, as a community, as an individual, are there things that we can do to help in any way we possibly can, so we can have a world that will be different for future generations?
Yeah, I don't, yeah. I mean, I appreciate you saying that, Judy, I do. I think certainly the Jerusalem Foundation is a great place to start. If I'm truthful, they've asked me, with full disclosure, they've asked me to join their Canadian board, and I've said yes. So they're voting me in next week. So hopefully they'll agree to me. Thank you. They're certainly doing tremendous work. And so my advice would always be the same, actually, is because I'm always trying to think about what is the best thing that we can do right now? Like, what is the most constructive, positive, best thing, best action that we can take moving forward? So, and I know I've been building these contacts in this network for a long time. But as I was meeting with everyone and I was like, I'm having this big, crazy idea. You know, what if I was able to put a trip together? I don't know who'd pay for it. I don't know who would support it. I don't know if people would be open to it. But if I did, would you want to be part of it? And they all said yes. And I think what's really powerful to me is actually the relationship building piece, right? It's really hard when you sit down and you have a meal with somebody, when you're able to hear their story, when you're able to ask about their family, when they're able to ask about yours, when they know, the last time I sat down with Sammy and they had made this like weird mustard dip because it was in season, and he was like, this is out in the garden, she's a gardener. Like, the fact that you can build relationships, to me, is the most important part of anything that we can choose to do on a positive, constructive basis. So maybe my big crazy idea isn't so crazy, Judy. Maybe there are people who would want to go, and I'm not sure what it would look like, and I'm not sure what it would mean. But maybe there are more people who are willing to hear different sides. In fact, Sammy was actually saying that he would want it to be dual narrative. And I said, no, important for us to hear perspectives and not be like one or the other, but actually hear it all, absorb it all, not have an agenda, not have a foretold conclusion, be able to see it, feel it, understand. So I don't know. I mean, I know, Judy, you're already part of lots of initiatives for community resiliency. And between those two things, I think that's all we can do. Yeah, Alan, Sherry, you still have your hand up? Sorry,
Yeah, I'm
Judy.
just thinking about that. I don't know, Judy, we haven't met. My name's Yael. Sherry and I recently moved, or in the process of moving to Vermont, where there's a community initiative that's very moving. There, for context in which to hear perspectives of people on, shall we say, both sides of the conflict who've suffered, there's really nothing more powerful than the parent circle. These family members on both sides of the conflict who've lost people, who people close to them have died in the conflict. And they do a number of public programs. There's unfortunately an expanding groups of people in Israel who, and made up of Israelis and Palestinians who participate in these, people who've chosen reconciliation over revenge despite the hardest imaginable personal loss. And they do public programs as well. So they have a joint Memorial Day ceremony, and your community can bring in two speakers to meet with your community remotely. And there's also, so that's called the Parent Circle. And there's also a group called Standing Together, made up of Israelis and Arab Israelis working to expand possibilities for conversation about different scenarios in the future. And they will also you can bring them to your community for program as well.
Hmm. Thank you, Yael. It's interesting because I actually reached out to Standing Together to meet with them when I was there. And they're the one group that I wasn't able to meet with. Unfortunately, just the timing, we only ended up actually connecting like really on my last couple of days. They are a really interesting group for sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's important. This concept of normalization to me is very important. And there is a real feeling of anti-normalization. To be honest, you actually see it on these campus protests quite a bit. This like refusal to engage with Zionists, refusal to engage with Jewish community members. And to me, it gives me the automatic reflex of talking about anti-normalization structures within Palestinian societies. And I think if I have a message that I would want to impart into those communities, it's that the action of coexistence and normalization are linked. You can't bring forward coexistence without the possibility of normalizing relationships or understanding that Israel, I mean, ultimately, nobody's going anywhere. And once you can admit that nobody's going anywhere, then you can start to have active conversations about how to live together. And unfortunately, on both sides, there are people who are still firmly saying the other side is going to go somewhere, and that, of course, is not true. So I think it's important that we keep talking that same talk, right? Keep talking the talk about how important person-to-person relationship building is. You know, in the 80s and 90s, when Oslo was on the horizon and or Oslo was so recent and was thinking to be a real possibility, there were so many person-to-person programs. I even had my taxi driver was talking to me about his son being involved in these programs. And the budgets for these things have just been decimated in Israel. And so much of the left in Israel has been decimated. And you're starting to see a reemergence. But I think we also have to understand that post October 7th, everything has changed. And security needs are really important. Like that beginning piece when I was talking about points of trauma, we have to acknowledge those points of trauma, because here in the West, it's easy to have conversations with Muslim friends. It's much harder. It's exponentially harder when trust and fear get in the way of those conversations and those relationships. And I don't think we can be, and I'm a huge optimist, as everyone on this call probably already knows. But optimism has to be pointed with reality to understand that people are afraid of each other right now. And that in order for us to move forward, we have to make people feel less afraid. And so groups like Standing Together are doing that. But they're very politically motivated. And for me, it starts with relationship. I guess that's my personal metric. So how do we start building those relationships? And maybe, Judy, another answer to that question is renewing some of those initiatives to be in closer contact with some other communities here. And how we do that, and I know that that's difficult also, but I think it's important to do that work, because that work is the only place it can go.
And one of the things that's been very meaningful for me, I think, Joanna, that, one of our grandsons goes to the Muslim daycare, and getting to know those people and see how loving they are and how caring, it's been very heartwarming. And it's, and I'm sure most of them know, if not all of them know, that he's Jewish. But it doesn't make a difference. We're more alike than different. Yeah.
Thanks, Judy. Anyone else? I want to be mindful of your time and appreciate that you're here. Betsy, you have one more thing?
I found that what you said at the beginning about that this war from the beginning till now has hit both sides in their area of biggest vulnerability, and describing those vulnerabilities, and to me that makes so much sense and makes it much easier to understand how scary this is for both sides and everyone. And I mean, I kind of wish that every conversation about this would start there.
Mhm.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to send out, as you know, this has been a recorded session, so I will send out a link if you want to share it and put it out on social media. And if you want to connect me with someone who A, you think I should talk to, or B, would like the link, then please do. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Joanne, for doing this.
Thank you.
Great job, Joe.
Thanks, guys.